Always, dude. I stay ready.
All right. Well, welcome to Beyond the Workouts podcast. I'm the head coach of Beyond Strength Endurance, Kyle Holman, and got a special guest with us today. Met this guy online and had several chats. It's just been good to talk through stuff. So this is Matt, the owner of Primal Mobility, and we're going to chat about some things kind of from two different aspects, kind of from the strength and conditioning side on my end, and then the kind of mobility and movement side from Matt's point of view there with his company. So basically, what we're going to dive into today is kind of some topics I've come across in all the years of my coaching. So one of them is, kind of the difference between discomfort, pain, and injury. The kind of delayed gratification versus instant gratification things that we see a lot, not only in our society, but in training. And then really just want to dive in. I know I've had some things in becoming a strength coach and learning more. Just going to chat with Matt about, as he's learned more in mobility and movement, how has that affected his own training and things that he does. So let's get rolling here. So yeah, man, one thing that I see a lot in all the years of coaching is, when we have an injury and we need to shut something down, or is this just discomfort? Discomfort to me, I always joke at my age, if I woke up and didn't have some ache or pain, I would think I was dead. But you challenge yourself enough in training, there's going to be some discomfort here or there. Then you might have something that's painful where, okay, I might have tweaked something here and I need to back off of something a little bit or avoid a little bit. And then hopefully very rarely do we experience an injury. But what I always tell people is there's always a way to continue with your consistent training. Sometimes it's like, oh man, my shoulder is bothering me, so I'm going to take 2 weeks off. Well, that's going to be hard to stay consistent with that. And unfortunately, there's been some times too where I feel like doctors are the ones who are saying like, oh, you have knee pain. Okay, don't squat for a month. And stuff like that. So I guess kind of what are your thoughts on those things and what have you seen in that aspect?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, dude. Appreciate it. I'm stoked to have this conversation. I know that you have a lot of experience in the industry, so I think that kind of our varying perspectives are going to be an opportunity for a really cool conversation. My thoughts on injury and pain and discomfort, like that's like a big topic, right? There's a lot of shit that falls into that. Right. So my first initial thought is that when we start looking at the fact that athletes or individuals are looking to train at a particular level, they're looking to push themselves and loading movement patterns anything over 70%, right? Like we're looking at the fact that these individuals are performing at a relatively high level, right? In comparison to what the average individual is doing.
Sure.
When you're training at that level, injuries and discomfort and pain are part of the process. It's inevitable that you're going to experience some level of injury, some level of pain and whatever, right? However, I will accept that and take that and happily go through those inevitable injuries in the exchange for what the opposite is feeling discomfort and pain from muscle atrophy and lack of bone density and injuries from falling because I have shit balance and whatever else, right? So injuries, pain, discomfort, it's inevitable with performance. And I think that, as you said, there's definitely a lot of people who will naturally take time off from the gym to avoid further injuring or potentially exacerbating the symptoms or prolonging that discomfort. And as you said, I do think that there are a lot of opportunities to continue training through that process. But one of the main things is that we need to kind of shift our expectations and shift the perspective and intention that we have with the training during those times. So maybe now, as opposed to progress, maybe now we're looking at maintenance and we need to shift what progress looks like, right? So in many cases, progress for a lot of athletes will look like more weight on the barbell. That's not always the case, right? If you understand training, progress can look 1,000 different ways. You just truly need to understand what you're looking for and how, angle your lens a little bit to be able to see it in the right light, right? So the way I see it is that there's multiple different ways that we can approach training through injury. So that can look something like trying to maintain the stimulus. So for example, if squats, they fire up knee pain, they trigger knee pain for me. That doesn't mean I need to completely get rid of squats. Maybe now I just need to find a way to maintain that stimulus. So continue to find a way to do that pattern, but in a way that's not going to trigger that pain. So maybe that looks like split squats, or right, like maybe it's a different type of pattern, or a similar pattern that's just going to not trigger that pain. Or we're going to now find a way to still engage and apply a stimulus to the muscles that would be built through that pattern in a different way. That doesn't
that could also be right, like static holds, or tempo
right,
work.
isometrics.
You could back off the weight, but go through tempo to get through that. The mindset thing that you bring up is such a huge piece of this, right? Because I think that's sometimes the most frustrating thing when you have an ache or a pain. Like you're like, otherwise I feel good and I want to hit this hard, but I can't right now. So that's a very good point to bring up of shifting your mindset and changing your expectations of what training is about right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of athletes will also be stubborn through that process too, right? And I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing in my perspective, because being stubborn is what helps them perform at the level that they do, right? And this is obviously referring to really high level athletes. Being stubborn and working hard and pushing through discomfort, that's how they got to where they are, right? However, if we're talking about people who are just like weekend warriors or just literally want to train strength for life, there's different ways to go about it. And we want to try to avoid that stubbornness. So to kind of take a step back and look at discomfort versus pain, because those two can be kind of like easily confused. The way we describe it and the way we educate coaches on it is that discomfort is anything below a 3 or a 4 on the scale of 10. As soon as you go above that, we're starting to approach the realm of pain, right? And, working through pain can definitely have its benefits, predominantly in a rehab protocol, predominantly in a rehab perspective. Now, a lot of us are not rehab professionals, maybe not physical therapists or whatever the case is. So we don't want to instill pain through movement. Now, there's a lot of different reasons as to why we wouldn't want to do that. And that's my personal bias, because what we do is affected by pain, right? So we try to limit the amount of pain. And one of our golden rules, or actually the golden rule at Primal Mobility, is never approach pain. So I could dive into the nuances as to why we talk so deep about that, but
I think it's a good education process too for people, that you got to accumulate some training hours to understand the difference between these things. I remember I was working with a volleyball club, and it was like 12 to 18s, and so some of, especially these 12-year-olds, really hadn't done any type of real training yet. And of course, we're just doing kind of body weight strength training, but we're doing air squats. And this one girl stopped, and I'm like, "What's up?" And she's like, "Just my legs are burning." I'm like, okay.
Good. That's great.
Right.
Keep going.
But for her, like, that was a learning process, right? I mean, she had never had that occur before. So I can imagine now when that first occurs, you're like, oh man, something's wrong.
Off.
So
yeah.
But so I think that is there's only one way to kind of learn that, is to experience things. And occasionally, like you said, if you're really trying to push it to a high level, you're going to dip over sometimes, and there's going to be something that occurs. But that's how you start to understand the difference between these things, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And I know that you and I have had a conversation about younger athletes and dealing with different movement patterns and stuff. And of course, proprioception, like the awareness of where your body is in space, goes such a long way with reducing risk of injury, first of all. But that is only developed through practice too. So, talking about movement patterns and looking at how younger athletes move, the risk of injury is slightly higher just because they don't necessarily know how to move through the patterns appropriately. So trying to load up a squat pattern for somebody who doesn't know how to actually engage their muscles through that squat pattern, it's going to probably look like a bad time at some point, right? Although getting them to load that pattern is it's kind of like it's like a catch-22, because loading that pattern is one thing that's going to improve their proprioception too.
Right. Yeah.
So anyways, that's kind of like a sidebar, but
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think that's a kind of a good segue into kind of speaking about youth and kind of what we all deal with in this new age society sometimes is the biggest this difference between instant and delayed gratification. Um,
Mm.
there, I saw a stat or something the other day that was like if the video that we've clicked on, whether on our phone or our computer, doesn't load within 10 seconds, the average person gets frustrated and moves on. So that's where we're at right now. Like we're not
I've
willing to
caught
wait
myself doing
10
that.
seconds. I know, well, I'm the same. I mean, it's
I'm the same way.
but when you think about that, it's just amazing how much that is carried over into training, whether we're talking about strength and conditioning or movement and mobility. It's, I mean, people literally will do one workout and like want to look in the mirror and see that they've lost 10 pounds or something. I mean, it's, they want everything to happen so quickly. A good quote I saw the other day was that, discipline is delayed gratification.
Mm.
Being able to stick with it is discipline, right? And we're going for the, reward down the road as opposed to right now. So I guess kind of speak to that. What have you seen in your business with your athletes of how maybe that's affected them or even yourself?
Well, that's super interesting that you're bringing that up. Before I dive into that and answer your question, I was listening to a podcast yesterday with, oh my goodness, what's his name? He's an author. It was the Modern Wisdom podcast. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, who's so with oh my goodness, who hosts that? My brain is Chris
No, I can't.
Wilcox. Yeah, he had Morgan Housel on there. I'd never heard of the guy. He's an author. He has written multiple books, and one of the concepts that they were talking about in that is that dopamine as it is at its highest in the anticipation of something.
Yeah.
So what's funny is that we're literally happier thinking about achieving something than we are when we do achieve it. We are happier through the process than when we actually have what we are in the process of trying to achieve, which is mind-blowing to think about.
Yeah, that is wild because so many people I feel like want to be a part of the outcome, but not the process. Or you hear all the time like embrace the journey, not
Right,
about the
right.
destination. But yeah, that's crazy.
And they're just robbing themselves of that,
Yeah,
all the joy that could come from that entire process, right? So that was a really interesting perspective for me. And I've
yeah,
heard of this kind of like in passing in the past, but to hear it the way they had that conversation was, it was very, very interesting. And it made me think about exactly what we're talking about now. So the way I see that like show up in the mobility world in our work with our clients and with our students, well, we'll start off with the clients because with the students, that's like a different problem for sure. It's
yeah,
more like business related and
sure.
seeing the results with their clients. Of course, coaches want to see results with their clients instantly
Yeah,
because those clients are putting pressure on them to get results, right?
right.
So something like mobility and movement mechanics, these things take a lot of time to improve, just like building strength. That's something that takes like legitimate strength that takes decades to build, right?
Yep.
Like it takes years to actually form like a strong squat, like putting 4 or 5 plates on a bar. That takes a long ass time. Now, with mobility, the problems that we're solving generally are pain related or discomfort or less frequently positional related, right? So performance. Um, and with those people who have those goals, they're generally high level athletes looking to get an edge on their competition, right? And those that are dealing with discomfort, they're limited in what gives them joy and what helps them build confidence in their life. That being said, the population we work with is barbell athletes, people who go to the gym and use that as an opportunity to build confidence and to crush their stress and to feel better about themselves in whatever way and feel strong, right? And if that is taken away from them or the ability to do that at the level that they expect of themselves is taken away from them, that's a huge hit on a lot of their
Yeah,
psychological makeup, right? So that definitely comes to a point where people expect or not necessarily expect, but there's like a deep desire to get rid of that pain and that discomfort almost immediately, right? And before you jump in there, I was just going to say that most people will see mobility training as stretching, just long bouts of
Yeah.
stretching. And they're like, it's not working. It's getting really frustrating. And because that's not what mobility training is, that's a component of it. There's
Sure.
that's one piece of the puzzle, like an ingredient within the recipe. But there's so much more than that. And then once we start actually implementing a strength-based protocol like progressive overload and getting them to control their movements and engage their muscles, they start to see that there is a result relatively quickly. And then there's a lot of joy that comes from that, right? So I think it all comes down to reframing expectations, and that comes with I think it comes with wisdom.
Yeah. Well, and to be, you got to be in this for the long haul. This is like I tell people in training, I mean, this is something that you should want to do for the rest of your life. I mean, there's really, people like to use the excuse of age. Well, once I get older, well, that's, you know what, there are a lot of people. I mean, I'm 41 and I'm still hitting PRs, and I played a college sport. So, I mean, it's, it can still continue to occur. But I think with a lot of this stuff, a couple things like, when you get an injury, that from personal experience, it's tough to have patience to, if you need to let it completely heal for a minute, then you start the strengthening and movement to, find the root of the cause and fix the issue. So hopefully we don't have it again. But that can be frustrating. Like you said, I like to lift heavy. So if there's something that's preventing me from lifting heavy, that's very challenging for me to stay patient while I let that progress. But I think the other thing that people miss with movement and mobility is it should be, kind of the term I heard a long time ago, like prehab. Like you should be looking at your movement and, fixing the movement pattern and shoring up the things so that we don't get injured, as opposed to a lot of times it seems like in your realm, like people wait till they have an injury and now they come to you and are like, hey, I have pain. How do we fix this? So I think that is a whole interesting thing, which I'm sure you come across a lot. But what are your thoughts on that? I just feel like people don't see it as preventative when it could be.
Yeah. And again, that goes with like the whole gratification situation, right? Like people are generally only going to start actually taking mobility training seriously when there's a problem to be solved.
Right.
Right. That's the thing. Most people won't come to us until they've been dealing with discomfort to a point where now the pain point is so high that they need to take action on it, or else the frustration and whatever else is going to take over and just be worse than the pain point itself. So that's usually where we get a lot of people coming in is at that point where they haven't been feeling their best under the barbell or whatever the case is. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can go into it in terms of like delaying gratification and whatever else, but I think with things like mobility training, there's no way that we're going to kind of change the way the entire society sees how or perceives the world, or how they run through their lives. So I think it's our expectations that have changed in terms of like, now we just expect people to come in with pain points as opposed to coming in with the prehab perspective. Although I completely agree with what you're saying, is that's a massive way to prevent injuries. Is one, improve the movement potential of your joints, increase your movement options, right? So allow yourself more range of motion, more space to move through, to be able to not get caught in a potentially compromising position in your training. And this stuff will naturally help you engage your muscles better. So you're going to get a better stimulus through your entire squat pattern, for example, and your legs are going to grow better. Your glutes are going to grow better. You're going to feel better during your squats, whatever the case is. And yeah, I completely agree. I think the prehab perspective would be a nice ideal for sure. But again, I don't think that's something that we're going to change for people. Like, this is just how society sees the world. There's a problem.
Especially not holistically. but you can approach it one, client at a time. They come in with pain, you help them with that, and then hopefully try to change their
Yeah,
mindset on that moving
exactly.
forward. Yeah.
Exactly. And usually that's the case, right? Like once they start to learn the nuances of mobility training and see that it's it's interesting how people will come in, they'll perceive one thing being mobility is stretching, whatever else. Like, I just don't know what to stretch and how to stretch it. Can you
Right.
show me how to do it? And then we show them that there's a legitimate strength-based protocol. Like, we apply progressive overload, we're getting you active in the positions, we're challenging the mechanics afterwards so that you can actually take the results that you've used or that you've gained through your mobility training and apply them to your movement patterns now. And people see that and they're like, this is far more fascinating than I thought it was. And they
Yeah.
start to understand the benefits behind it. And then they carry that off into their life for sure. So yeah,
It is
one
funny
person at
because
a
I
time.
will have people ask me that, like in the gym, like they'll be like, my whatever, my shoulders kind of bother me. What stretches should I do? Like that's usually the first thing everybody asks, is what
Yeah.
stretches to do.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, like there's a lot of people who shouldn't be stretching, right? Like
Yeah.
hypermobility or just a lack of tension within the joints. Like I have dislocated my left shoulder um roughly 7 times. I lost count after the sixth, so I don't know if there was more dislocations or just a bunch of subluxations, but it was at least 6 times. And there was a ton of discomfort in that shoulder, of course. And the main thing is that it was lacking tension now. It would just
Yeah.
pop out, no problem, right? So I started out trying to stretch it because it would relieve the discomfort for that short period of time because my joints were trying to create local
Right.
stability by really tightening up the muscles around it. And my reaction early on, and like before I even figured out what mobility training was to stretch the shit out of it. And the symptoms obviously never went away. And my weakness in that shoulder only got worse. And so
Okay.
what I needed was stability. I needed to increase the tension in the joint. And that's just me trying to explain that not everyone should be stretching, and
Yeah.
more people should be approaching movement in a control based perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, that really rolls greatly into, the last thing we're talking about is you mentioned, before you learned about your mobility and movement, that's what you're doing. So as you've learned more, so as you've gotten more into, the movement patterns and mobility and all these things, I'm curious how that has affected your own training. And I'll kind of frame it with, we had in our gym a while back, we had some movement mobility guys. And what was interesting is that it's like, as the more they learned, sometimes they would be out there and be like, well, my left side isn't firing correctly, so I need to do this. And like, it was all these things that it's almost like they kept adjusting. And from my perception, it always is like, man, for mobility guys, you guys seem like you're injured all the time, because seemed like they were always modifying training because of some movement pattern or something. And I think it was just in their head, to be honest. They were overthinking it too
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
much, that as the more they learned, the more aware they were of things. And so that was, I think, kind of muddying the waters, so to speak. So I guess
Yeah,
what's your perspective on that?
that sounds like the prime example of informed pessimism. Like they knew, because they're working with so many people, or just so conscious of the potential reasons for discomfort, they became almost obsessive over the fact that not everything needs to be perfect, or not
Right.
everything was perfect, right? And as soon as they started becoming more aware of like this being slightly off during this movement, it's like, oh, this is wrong. I can't do this properly. I need to focus on something else, or I need to find a different way to approach this, or whatever else. One of the things that I've really focused on over the last 6 years in my career is focusing on the fact that movement isn't perfect. And humans are master compensators. And that is to our benefit. We don't need like that. It's so common for coaches to be like, no, 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 too much knee valgus. You can't be squatting. Like, or we need to do this and wrap a band around your knees and do this and, whatever else. We need to substitute or scale an exercise or regress or whatever. My thoughts are that, like, for the most part, like, of course that is warranted in many, many cases. But if it comes down to hyper obsessing over movement patterns and mechanics, like the fine details of movement mechanics, and kind of harping on a client when they're off by a fraction of an inch or something like that, that's only going to create more problems. There's no such thing as flawless mechanics anyways. There is no such thing as flawless movement patterns, especially in the real world or in sport, right?
Yeah.
You're constantly pushed into what is deemed as compromised positions.
Sure.
You're constantly pushed into or challenged in spinal flexion when you're picking shit up off the ground in real life. Your knees are going to be far over your toes in so many cases, or knee valgus when you're like sprinting or cutting corners in football and stuff like that. These positions are you're going to be challenged within them in life and sport anyways. So to seriously work incredibly hard to avoid them in your training is only making you more fragile, in my opinion, in the world of sport and fit and life, honestly. So the way I see things now is like, let's focus more on exposing these often compromised positions, and what are the mechanics of that, and why are they often compromised? Well, spinal flexion, a lot of people, I mean, 99% of people have been taught to do deadlifts with a neutral spine. And if you get out of neutral spine, drop the bar. Don't even move it, right? Yep. It's like neutral spine, neutral spine, neutral spine. And while that definitely has its merit, like there's a lot of value to doing that. It is a safer position to be lifting in. It makes us very weak in other positions. Right. So spinal flexion and extension is now weak.
I mean, we've talked about it with the imbalances like in sport, like what I was asking about, my daughter who's a volleyball player and is constantly hitting this way. I played baseball and I took a million swings from one side of the plate and not the other. So I agree with that it is, especially in sport, there's no way you're going to make it even. I mean, there's absolutely no way. So it is good to embrace that. And then you bring up another good point that, yes, there are the basic mechanics of a deadlift, a squat, and all these movements that we do, but because of, anatomy, limb length, torso length, knee length, even within your leg, your upper leg, lower leg, those are different lengths for people. So you are going to have these variances that occur because of anatomy and biomechanics of that individual's body. In that. So, that's a good point with that. Have you seen it in your training, significantly change what you're doing or how you go about things because of, the more things you've learned?
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny because what you were mentioning before about those movement guys at your gym, I definitely have experienced that to an extent as well. And I try to purposely catch myself whenever I'm getting into that state and just be open with weird movements sometimes, or just, you know what I mean? Like not being flawless, or like when I'm getting a bar overhead, letting my scapula move around in weird positions. Like I'm getting more and more okay with that and just being less focused on like, brace the core, make sure the pelvis is in the perfect position, depress the scapula, slowly control, you know what I mean? It's like, no, let's just move the weight and see how it feels. Now, I've definitely caught myself doing that, but one of the benefits that came from all the knowledge and like going through that process for myself is the ability to understand how to substitute more appropriately in my training when it is needed. And this is mostly down to the point of how I'm feeling for the day. Right. So it's not necessarily around long-term issues, chronic issues like my left shoulder, but it's more around like, how did I sleep last night? Okay, so now I can expect, like, I got 2 hours of sleep because I had to bring my kid to the hospital on Monday. That day, I knew I was going to be at a higher risk of injury because I was so fatigued and my muscles weren't going to be able to contract and my nervous system was all fucked up. Like I was naturally at a greater risk of injury because of that reduced sleep, right? And that was like, I framed my expectation that way. And I knew that I was going to likely experience more discomfort because I wasn't well rested. So I went into my training like that. And I'm like, you know what? Today, and again, I have that long-term perspective like we were chatting about before, like that long game. That's what I'm playing. I was like, I'm reducing the weight today.
Yeah.
That was my intention. It said, I'm focused on getting good contractions in my muscles, and I know that's going to be a challenge. So I'm going to get rid of the ego and just kind of reduce the weight and focus on
Yeah.
getting a good burn in my muscles. And that's my main intention through the movements. Now,
Yeah.
I've done this in many different ways, and it's focusing on, the same kind of concepts, is like just changing my progressive overload
Yeah.
principle that I'm using, right? So taking away the weights and instead focusing on reducing my rest, or adding volume in some capacity, whether that's another set or maybe another rep, or more time under tension, just slowing the reps down. So those nuances to training, the way we apply them in our mobility programming, because a lot of mobility movements are really challenging to add any kind of loading to, like external loading being dumbbells, barbells, kettlebells, whatever.
Sure.
We've had to get very creative with progressive overload principles. And that has really helped frame for me how I can approach my own training in those days where things do get a little dicey. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's such a huge point because I'm sure you're the same, but I just preach to people so much that consistency is the number one thing
Yeah.
that is going to
In
help you the
everything.
most, and
It's
absolutely
success for
everything.
anything.
Absolutely. And so you got to know that yeah, there's days where I show up and like you said, whether it's lack of sleep or hey, maybe life just kind of kicked my ass that day and I'm just not
Yeah.
feeling like I'm up to it, but I'm still there. And that might mean backing off the weight a little bit or maybe changing something completely sometimes, but it is the ability to just keep showing up. Um, Gosh, it's so much easier to keep going than it is to continually start over. And I think that's what people deal with a lot is that life is always going to happen, whether it's something external in your work or with your family or with your body, you injured it. And if you're constantly stopping and then just starting over, then you're just on this wheel. And as opposed to, like you said, using that, okay, I know I just don't have 100% in the tank today, but I got 60% and I'm going to come in and I'm going to give 60%. And that's another day that I've,
Mm-hmm.
added and allows me to stay consistent. I do that a lot in heavy lifting these days. I just go off feel. Even if we're supposed to work to a 1 rep max and at the end of this training cycle, sure, I'm going to put weight on the bar and go heavy, but I might not get to my max or a PR today, but
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. That's once again, I'm in this. I know I'm going to max again. So, I'm in this for the long game. So I think that's a huge point to bring up of using that to stay consistent, which I feel a lot of people fall off a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean that whole perspective is so, it's again, the word wisdom comes to mind. Like it's only honed in through experience, right? Like, and knowing that the ego is really only going to fuck you up in the long term. And whenever ego is present, you're going to get brutally reminded that it's
Yeah,
not something that's
sometimes you get
helpful.
humbled real quick.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the case, right? Like that's exactly a prime example of how fucking quick you can get humbled by ego, is that you're deciding to go heavy even though you slept like shit, you didn't approach your training the way you should have over the last 6 weeks, and you're still going to try and throw an extra 15 pounds on the bar than you've ever squatted before. You're likely going to have a bad time. Right, so I mean that's just a prime example of how you can get brutally reminded every time, or very quickly, that the ego is not necessarily a helpful thing in many cases.
Yeah. Have you ever
But
read
what you were saying
Henry
is that
Rollins' Iron and Soul?
no, I haven't.
It's super good. Real quick, I didn't mean to step in on you there, but at one point he just talks about the reason why he likes the iron is that it's the all knowing. It's the 100% perspective giver, because 200 pounds is always 200 pounds. He talks about, you can walk outside in the world and people could tell you you're amazing or that you're an asshole, but the weight is always the weight. Like you can think you can
So
lift
true.
it's going to let you know, or you might not think you can lift it and you can, but that's just such a solid point that those things will always let you know real quick whether you got it or you don't, and or if you've approached it correctly, like you said, or you didn't.
That's interesting. I guess that's a great gauge if you're somebody who doesn't really know how to read your body properly. It's like, well, how's the weight feeling today?
Yeah.
Does it feel
Yeah.
fucking heavy? Like that 15-pound dumbbell that you were supposed to warm up with? does that feel heavy as shit? Then that's a good sign that, you know, something's a little off. Your nervous system is probably a little fried today. You may need to adjust your expectations moving into the actual training protocol. So, I mean, one thing that you were saying early on is like, what if you have momentum, if you've been training for a while, it's easier to continue going. And, you know, those that take a break for a week or whatever, like, I just don't feel like training today, it's always harder to get back into it. And then that cycle can just easily repeat itself. And a quote that came to mind that I think could resonate with a lot of people with this is a body in motion will tend to stay in motion. It's always easier to maintain momentum than it is to, and this is all about consistency, right? It's always easier to maintain that momentum that you've built up than to stop and restart over and over again. And that's something that like should fuel us, is like, well, fuck, do I want, and I'm sorry if I'm cursing and I do that a lot, but
we'll just mark this episode as explicit. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do I want to have to go through that process of struggling hard to get back into this momentum piece again? Or do I want to kind of just ride that wave and just kind of like maybe take it a little easier today instead of completely taking the day off? Right. So I think that's a cool perspective too, is that again, like consistency is one of the most important things, regardless of what you're trying to build or do. You got to show up frequently. Doesn't necessarily mean every single day. You should be moving every day, but it doesn't mean you necessarily need to load your body to whatever extent every single day, but you really should be doing it on a weekly basis for sure.
Well, yeah, when you look at long-term athlete development, you look at training age and chronological age, right? So chronological age, I'm 41. Training age, I've been training consistently for 26 or 27 years now. I tell people all the time, like, to try to hone in on this consistency thing that we keep hammering here, is the more years you accumulate, the higher your training age gets, the less time off will affect you. I mean, as I've been like mobility, right? If I'm consistent with mobility and movement for a very long time, and then maybe I have, you know, some type of injury that, you know, heaven forbid, makes me bedridden for a week or two or whatever, that's going to affect that person less who has been consistent than it is the person who's been sporadic or hasn't been doing it at all. I mean, at this point, I always joke, I could probably take a full month off of strength training and it probably wouldn't affect me a whole lot. Now, someone who's only been strength training for a year, they take a full month off, it's like they're damn near starting back at ground zero again. So that should be motivation for people, that the more days and weeks and months and years I can accumulate, then the less, if I do have an injury or whatever, the less that's going to affect me on my overall levels.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Basically, what you're saying is that you've built up a strong, robust foundation, right? And you're able to kind of lean on that in some cases. Like if you get sick, it's not a big deal if you take 5 days off the gym, or, you know, whatever the case is. Or if you're on vacation, you don't need to stress, oh, where's the gym? Where's the gym? Although you still may be frantically looking for a gym because it's a form of therapy for you.
Right.
You don't need it. You're not going to lose your gains. And that's kind of a tough perspective, I think, for a lot of athletes and coaches to get over, is that I'm usually okay taking some time off, and like that week off shouldn't negatively affect my thought process or my mental state in a way that is going to negatively affect my training, or because it's not going to impact how I feel within a year, because I have that perspective of consistency, right? Like that's how people should be perceiving it, I think. But that goes a long way to just saying, like, continue to build that foundation. I love that perspective. I really love that thought, where it's take the time to build a foundation, focus on the basics, build legitimate strength, and that will naturally carry over into so many different things for the long run, and give you so many additional benefits that make things so much easier.
Yeah. I used the example the other day of, you know, if you put $1 in a jar every day, when you're putting $1 in there, especially in our current society, you can't even get a can of Coke anymore for that. $1 doesn't, it seems like nothing. Like it seems pointless. It's like, why even bother? But if you do that for a year, you have $365, which
Hmm.
once again might not be a ton of money, but
Buys
you
you a
still
case of Coke.
accumulated. Yeah, right. You still accumulated that because of what you did daily. And I think that's a tough thing for people to wrap their minds around, because especially if you have a day where you're just not feeling that great. I remember one time it just got to the end of the day and I had not got a workout in. I dropped my daughters off at gymnastics. It was snowing outside, but I'm like, whatever, I haven't moved today. So I went and ran around the parking lot for 15 minutes. That's where it's easy to be like, well, what was even the point of that? Like, but to me, it was the principle of the matter that I still made myself move on that day. But that experience in that day helps me stay consistent. So it was, while it wasn't much in the moment, that can pay huge dividends later, maybe more from a mental aspect or a mindset aspect. And I think that's hard for people to grasp sometimes if they, do something small on some day and they're like, well, they'll think like, well, what's the point? If it's only going to be 10 minutes, then what's the point? And I think they can, if they would embrace that, it would go a long way.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example of imperfect action. You know what I mean? Imperfect action over perfect inaction. So 15 minutes in the fucking parking lot, it's not going to necessarily do much for you, like
right.
physically necessarily. I mean, it will definitely help as you've gotten your heart rate up and whatever else. Like it's a healthy thing to do, but it's not necessarily going to take your performance to the next level. Right. But again, as you said, it's the principle. It's like, no, I take small action even when the ideal situation is not possible for me. Yeah. I love that. Like that's exactly how I try to approach my life too. Like I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, Monday to Friday.
I've seen that, man. You're getting it.
Yeah, Monday to Friday. So every week I'm waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'm building resources. I write blogs, I create courses. Like this is what I do. And those early morning hours are prime for me. If I don't get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I feel like I've missed something. It's like there's a solid opportunity that I have missed. And so it's like really addicting for me to continue to get up at 4. And some days if my alarm didn't go off or whatever, or again, I took my kid to the hospital on sure. Monday at 2:30 in the morning. I got back home at, I don't know, 5, whatever. And so when I got back home at 5, I said, instead of going back to bed like I was exhausted, I'm going to put half an hour into a blog. Yep. And it's the same kind of concept. You can carry that over into so many different things. And I think it's such a valuable perspective to have, is like perfect inaction. That's what it is. No, sorry. Imperfect action over perfect inaction. That's what it is.
It's super solid. I mean, I think sometimes we throw out these quotes like something is better than nothing, but I don't think people really embrace what that means. Like something is better than nothing. You know what I mean, right. Taking 30 minutes to work on your blog was better than taking 0 minutes to work on it.
Yeah. I was able to finish that blog article, whereas that would have went another day being unfinished.
Yeah.
Right. So it's that same thing. It takes you further. And that just comes down to consistency again. You're showing up and doing a little bit, you're still moving the needle. And that's what's most important, I think, is like that needle gets moved forward, and your ideal situation that you are chasing, you still had that opportunity to fight another day with the process. Right. And as we said earlier on, that's where the majority of that dopamine is through that process. So in the moment, it's fucking hard to do. It's like, I'd rather, it's snowing outside, it's slushy in the parking lot. I'd probably rather just not do that. But at the end of it, once you finish that 15 minutes, you're like, that was fucking sweet. Like, you feel nobody else was out there.
Right. Absolutely.
It's cool.
Yeah. That's good stuff, man. Looking forward to, we're going to do a kind of a series on that. So today we kind of dove into training, and we're going to get into some mindset and coaching and programming stuff on some other episodes. So yeah, man, good having you on. And we'll look forward to doing another episode here pretty soon, man.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, man.
Yep.